18,000 feet above the Pacific, Richard Bong was already supposed to be dead. His P-38 Lightning shuddered as cannon rounds ripped into the left engine. Warning lights flashed across the panel. Oil pressure dropped. Airspeed bled away. His wingman was gone, spiraling down in smoke toward the ocean below. And behind him, perfectly lined up, a Japanese Zero sat less than 200 yards off his tail. The Zero didn't rush the kill. It didn't need to. It matched every move Bong made with unsettling ease. Barrel rolls didn't work. Scissors didn't work. Splitters maneuvers bought him seconds at best. Every trick he'd learned at America's best fighter schools failed. Almost casually, he had maybe 10 seconds left, and with no options remaining, Bong did the one thing every instructor had drilled into him as a guaranteed way to die. He rolled the aircraft completely upside down and shoved the stick forward. The Lightning didn't dive. It fell. The ocean rushed upward as Bong plunged toward it, inverted, blood flooding into his head so violently that his vision turned red. Loose gear floated upward, slamming into the canopy. His engines screamed. His body fought forces no manual said a pilot could survive. For 2 seconds that felt like forever. Richard Bong flew blind when he finally rolled upright again. 6,000 feet lower, gasping for breath, the Zero was gone, not pulling away, not climbing, gone. What Bong didn't know in that moment was that he had just stumbled onto a maneuver that would quietly dismantle Japan's dominance in the Pacific skies. A move that looked insane, a move born from panic, and a move that worked because of something no Japanese engineer could fix in time. But to understand why that mattered, you have to understand just how terrifying the Zero had been. When American pilots first encountered the Mitsubishi, a 6M0 in 1941 and 1942, disbelief spread faster than fear. The aircraft didn't just outperform Allied fighters, it rewrote expectations. It turned tighter, climbed faster, flew farther. At combat speeds, it could complete a full turn in under 16 seconds. American fighters needed 7 seconds in a dogfight isn't a margin, it's a death sentence. Early battles over the Philippines, Wake Island, and the Dutch East Indies turned into slaughters. Kill ratios tilted wildly. In some engagements, Allied pilots were being taken out, 3, sometimes worse, but the Zero seemed untouchable. And that dominance wasn't luck. It was design. Japanese engineers had built the Zero with one obsession: maneuverability. Weight was stripped everywhere. No armor behind the pilot. No self-sealing fuel tanks. Thin aluminum skin stretched over a light frame pushed to its absolute limits. The result was an aircraft that felt alive in the air, responsive, graceful, deadly. But that elegance hid a flaw, one no one understood. Yet, American pilots, meanwhile, kept dying because they were fighting the Zero the wrong way. Their tactics still came from World War I thinking: turn with the enemy, outcircle them, stay in the fight until someone lines up a shot. That doctrine worked in Europe, where German fighters were heavier and less nimble. In the Pacific, it was lethal. Every time an American pilot tried to turn with a Zero, the outcome was the same. The Zero completed the circle first. Guns came around. Another plane went into the ocean. Some commanders noticed the pattern early. John Thatch famously developed the Thatch Weave, a cooperative defensive maneuver that saved lives by forcing Zeros to overshoot. It helped pilots survive, but it didn't win fights. What finally changed everything didn't come from a briefing room or a tactical manual. It came from desperation. In April 1943, Major Thomas Lynch found himself alone over the Solomon Islands, bounced by multiple Zeros with altitude advantage. Running flat wouldn't work. Turning would get him killed. Every escape option required a maneuver the Zero excelled at. So Lynch did what felt wrong. He rolled inverted and pushed forward. The dive was violent, disorienting, physically punishing. His vision flooded red. Blood vessels burst across his face. But something unbelievable happened. The Zeros couldn't follow. When Japanese pilots tried to roll inverted and stay with him, their aircraft protested. Airframes shuddered. Engines sputtered. Some simply quit. Lynch didn't just escape. He came back. Using the speed he'd gained in the dive, he zoomed back up, reversed position, and attacked from above. 2 Zeros never saw him coming. When he landed, his face was speckled red from burst capillaries. His eyes looked almost completely bloodshot. He had a headache that lasted days, but he was alive, and that night, over drinks, he told everyone exactly what he'd done. At first, pilots didn't believe him. Inverted flight was dangerous. Negative G-forces were no joke. Manuals warned against it for a reason, but Lynch had proof. The explanation turned out to be brutally simple. Negative G-forces don't just hurt pilots, they starve engines. The Zero's carbureted fuel system relied on gravity to feed fuel downward into the engine. When inverted, fuel flowed the wrong way. Push into a dive, and the engine coughed. Then it quit. American aircraft were different. Fighters like the P-38 used fuel injection. Orientation didn't matter. Upside down, sideways, nose down, fuel kept flowing. Physics had chosen a side. The tactics spread fast. Not through official channels, but through word of mouth. Veterans pulled rookies aside and told them the same thing. If a Zero gets on your tail, don't turn, don't climb, roll inverted and dive. It can't follow. Pilots called it different things. The inverted escape, the negative G dive. Eventually, it formalized into what we now call the splitters. The physical cost was brutal. Headaches, red eyes, temporary vision loss. Some pilots blacked out briefly. Flight surgeons documented everything and quietly let it continue, because the alternative was worse. Once pilots mastered the move, the balance of power flipped almost overnight. Before, a Zero on your tail meant seconds to live. Now it meant opportunity. American pilots would roll inverted, dive away, then use their speed to climb back above the Zero, attacking from the sun with overwhelming advantage. Japanese pilots weren't trained for this. Their doctrine revolved around turning combat. Their aircraft was optimized for it. Their confidence depended on it. Suddenly, it meant nothing. Even legendary aces like Saburo Sakai wrote about the confusion. He described lining up perfect shots, only to watch American fighters vanish downward in impossible dives. When he tried to follow, his engine betrayed him. Worse, the Americans always came back. By late 1943, the inverted dive wasn't a trick. It was strategy. P-38 pilots used it aggressively, baiting Zeros into chasing them. Corsair pilots dove so hard their aircraft screamed under the strain. P-47 pilots, heavier than anything else in the sky, used gravity like a weapon. Kill ratios reversed, 3-to-1, 4-to-1, sometimes more. Japan tried to respond. New fighters appeared, better and stronger frames, but it was too late. Experienced pilots were gone. Replacements were rushed. Training hours collapsed. The Zero, once unstoppable, became a liability. Richard Bong went on to become America's highest-scoring ace with 40 victories. He refined the maneuver that had saved his life, using it deliberately and repeatedly. Gun camera footage showed him calmly rolling, inverted, diving away. Then returning to finish confused opponents. He survived the war, but he didn't survive peace. On August 6, 1945, the same day the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima, Bong was killed testing a new jet fighter in California. He was 20-4. Today, restored P-38s still fly at air shows, sometimes performing the splitters maneuver that once changed history. Zeros sit quietly in museums, beautiful and fragile, reminders of how dominance can vanish when someone finds the flaw you never thought mattered. The Japanese Zero wasn't defeated by better guns or better planes. It was defeated by a pilot willing to do something that looked insane when death was already certain. Sometimes history doesn't turn on planning or technology. Sometimes it turns on one person desperate enough to fly upside down when everything says not to. And sometimes that's all it takes to change the outcome of a war. What made the inverted dive so devastating wasn't just that it worked, it was that it worked every single time. Once pilots understood the physics, air combat in the Pacific stopped being a fair fight. American pilots no longer reacted to the Zero. They dictated the engagement. Speed replaced turning, altitude replaced instinct, energy replaced elegance. And Japanese pilots felt the shift almost immediately. Reports from late 1943 began mentioning American fighters that refused to turn. Zeros would maneuver perfectly into position, only for their targets to vanish downward, engines screaming, before reappearing moments later from above. The rhythm of combat the Japanese had mastered simply stopped applying. Some Japanese units attempted to adapt. Pilots were warned not to follow American fighters into steep dives, but that created a new problem. If they didn't pursue, they surrendered initiative. If they did, they risked engine failure or structural breakup. Either choice favored the Americans. The Zero had been designed for a world where fights stayed flat and graceful. The Americans dragged the fight into the vertical, and the Zero couldn't live there by 1944. This shift reshaped every major air battle in the Pacific. Over New Guinea, over the Philippines, over Okinawa, American fighters roamed with confidence that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier. Pilots flew knowing that even if they made a mistake, even if a Zero slipped behind them, they still had an exit. That confidence mattered. And American pilots knew it. Veterans began teaching new arrivals a brutally simple rule. If you feel fear creeping in, go vertical. Speed cures panic. Gravity is your ally. Never fight where the Zero is strongest. Those lessons didn't stay confined to piston engine fighters. After the war, military analysts pored over combat reports, gun camera footage, and pilot interviews. One pattern kept appearing. Victories didn't come from tighter turns or sharper reflexes. They came from energy management, who controlled speed and altitude. That idea became doctrine. When jet combat arrived in Korea, pilots flying heavier American jets faced agile MiGs that could outturn them. Sound familiar? Once again, American pilots avoided turning fights and used speed dives and vertical separation to survive and win. In Vietnam, the lesson had to be relearned the hard way. Early losses forced the Navy to establish a school dedicated entirely to air combat tactics. They called it Top Gun, and at its core was the same idea born over the Solomon Islands: fight on your terms. Use physics, never give your opponent what they want. The inverted dive wasn't just a maneuver, it was a mindset shift. It proved that superiority doesn't come from perfection. The Zero was a masterpiece, but it was optimized for one style of war. Once that style disappeared, its advantages became weaknesses. That's the part of this story that often gets missed. The Zero didn't suddenly become bad, it became predictable, and predictability in combat is fatal. Richard Bong never sat down to write doctrine. He never planned to change air combat. He simply refused to die when the rulebook said he should. That refusal forced everyone else to rethink what was possible. And that's why this story still matters, because innovation doesn't always come from genius. Sometimes it comes from terror, sometimes it comes from panic, sometimes it comes from someone breaking every rule because following them guarantees the worst outcome. The Pacific Air War didn't turn because America built a perfect plane. It turned because pilots learned when not to fight. The Zero ruled the sky until someone dared to flip the world upside down. There's another reason the inverted dive mattered so much, and it had nothing to do with engines or aerodynamics. It changed how American pilots thought. Before 1943, pilots entered combat reacting to the Zero. Every move was defensive. Every decision was about survival. Once the inverted dive became common knowledge, pilots stopped fearing the Zero's strengths and started baiting them. That was the real turning point. Experienced P-38 pilots began deliberately slowing just enough to look vulnerable. They'd let a Zero commit, close the distance, line up the shot. Then, at the last second, they'd roll inverted and vanish downward. What followed was always the same. Either the Zero broke off and lost position, or it tried to follow and paid for it. Japanese pilots began writing home about American fighters that fell like stones and then reappeared from nowhere. Combat reports grew increasingly frustrated. Zeros were no longer dictating engagements. They were reacting, guessing, hesitating. And hesitation in air combat is fatal. The tactic also exposed a deeper issue Japan couldn't fix. Even when newer aircraft were introduced, Japan's training pipeline had collapsed. Early war Zero pilots had hundreds of flight hours. Late war replacements sometimes had fewer than 100. Teaching advanced energy tactics under combat pressure was impossible. Meanwhile, American pilots were flying longer tours, rotating home, then returning as instructors. Hard-earned experience spread fast. Mistakes were analyzed. Survivors taught newcomers exactly what worked. The gap widened with every month. By the time Allied forces pushed toward the Philippines, the Zero's reputation had flipped completely. Pilots no longer spoke of it with fear, but with calculation. They knew its limits. They knew what it couldn't do. And most importantly, they knew how to force it into losing situations. The skies belonged to whoever controlled energy, not elegance. Richard Bong embodied that shift. As his victory count climbed, he became less aggressive in the traditional sense and more surgical. He avoided prolonged turning fights entirely. He struck from advantage, disengaged instantly, and reset. Again and again. That discipline saved his life dozens of times. Ironically, the same mindset that made Bong unbeatable in combat also made his death feel especially cruel. After surviving the most dangerous air war in history, he died during a routine test flight of a jet fighter, not because of enemy fire, but mechanical failure. No dogfight, no warning, just silence. History is like that. Today, when pilots train in modern fighters capable of pulling forces that would have shattered World War II aircraft, they still learn the same core lesson. Don't chase turns. Don't fight fair. Don't give the enemy what they want. Energy wins wars in the air. And that lesson traces back to one moment, one terrified pilot, upside down, falling toward the Pacific with no idea if he'd survive the next second. The Japanese Zero was never truly defeated by superior firepower. It was defeated by a refusal to play by its rules. When the Zero ruled the sky, everyone believed it was unbeatable, until someone flipped the battlefield upside down and proved that sometimes the most dangerous move is the one nobody expects you to survive. That's how the Zero lost the Pacific. Not with a final battle, not with a better plane, but with a single decision made in panic and repeated by pilots who learned that gravity, when used correctly, could be deadlier than any gun. If you want the next story to go even deeper, another aircraft, another tactic, another moment where history turned on a split second, just say the word. What's haunting about the inverted dive isn't just that it worked, it's how close it came to never being discovered at all. If Richard Bong had blacked out a second earlier, if his airframe had failed, if his engines had quit, like the Zeros did, there would be no story, no tactical revolution, just another name on a casualty list. That's how thin the margin was. For more than a year, American pilots flew into combat without knowing the enemy had a flaw this severe. The Zero's weakness wasn't hidden by secrecy or deception, it was hidden by assumption. Everyone believed turning ability decided air combat, so no one questioned what happened when you stopped turning entirely. Once that mental barrier broke, everything changed fast. American pilots stopped thinking of the sky as flat. Combat became vertical. Altitude turned into currency. Speed became protection. Every engagement was about entering with advantage and leaving before the enemy could react. That philosophy didn't just beat the Zero, it ended an era of air combat. The war proved that agility alone was no longer king. Survivability, energy control, and adaptability mattered more. Aircraft designers took note. Post-war fighters grew faster, heavier, and stronger. The future belonged to planes that could dictate the fight, not dance inside it, and all of it traces back to one moment of terror over open water. There's something deeply human about that. Wars are often remembered through grand strategies and famous battles, but they're actually shaped by individuals making split-second decisions under pressure no one should ever face. Bong didn't invent a theory. He didn't set out to be clever. He simply refused to accept a future where he died doing exactly what he'd been told. That refusal saved his life, and eventually, thousands of others. Today, when historians talk about turning points in the Pacific Air War, they mention production numbers, logistics, radar, and pilot training. All of that mattered, but none of it would have meant much if pilots still believed the Zero was unbeatable in a fight. Belief matters in war. Once that belief broke, the Zero's dominance collapsed with it. The aircraft that once terrorized Allied pilots became something they could predict, exploit, and defeat. Not because it changed, but because the way it was fought changed. And that's the real lesson. The Zero didn't lose because it was flawed. It lost because someone finally figured out where it was flawed, and had the nerve to go there. History doesn't always reward the strongest or the smartest. Sometimes it rewards the person desperate enough to try something that looks insane, and lucky enough to live through it.